So good evening. I just came in from Pittsburgh, and I was told that Harrisburg would be a ghost town on the Thursday night before Labor Day. So thank you all for making it not a ghost town in here. This is incredible. It's so nice to see you all. My name is Conor Lamb. As I said, just came from Pittsburgh, where I used to be a Democratic member of Congress representing 6 different counties outside of the city of Pittsburgh. I'm from that area. I also have been a lawyer for about 15 years. Currently, in my post-congressional life, I am a partner at Klein Inspector out of Philadelphia. We represent civil plaintiffs, and also an adjunct law professor at Duquesne School of Law in Pittsburgh, the Thomas R. Klein School of Law, I should say, where I teach a course called Faith and Democracy, and that is part of what motivated me to want to be here tonight. But I am definitely not the one that you came to see. You are here to see our visitor from the great Harvard University, author of 2 books that you can buy, and I think both of them have signed afterward tonight if you want to, so keep that in mind. And that is Professor Daniel Ziblatt, who wrote How Democracies Die and Tyranny of the Minority. So this event is being put on by the Americans United to Preserve Democracy and Rule of Law. They have a speaker series sponsored by Democracy First and Democracy Century, the goal of which is to bring together experts from a lot of different backgrounds to address the critical challenging facing our democratic institutions. And we're going to talk about those tonight. This is actually the first edition of that series, so Professor Ziblatt is worthy of that honor for sure. I am not, but you know, I'm the one that they could get here tonight, so I thank you all for putting up with me in the moderator role. And with that, I think I'm just going to pass it off to Professor Ziblatt to offer his, this is what they told me to say, your expert independent analysis on the historic tests we face in safeguarding the future of democracy and upholding the rule of law. So that's an easy one to start off with, right?
Right.
Go ahead.
Good. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you everybody for coming out tonight. I haven't been in Harrisburg before. It's wonderful to be here. I love the humidity. It's great to be here also. Thank you, Conor, for doing this as well. And thanks to the organizers for organizing this great event. Yeah, so this, you know, we hope this is a conversation about democracy. I mean, we're in a particular moment where there's good reason that people are thinking about this. It's, you know, on the eve of an election, and there's a lot of attention to the horse race. But I think it's really important to keep in mind the stakes of any election, in particular this election. So I wrote these 2 books. In a way, you know, as a political scientist, as a professor of political science, I teach at Harvard. I have the luxury of stepping back and trying to think about the big picture. And I think that is useful to do because that does alert us to the stakes of things, to look at other historical periods in our own history, look at the history of democracy in other places, to try to understand both the threats, the peril that democracies face, but also to emphasize that there are lots of sources of resilience in American democracy, and to think about those as well. Because if we think about those, then I think we can reinforce those sources of resilience to deal with these challenges. So anyway, wonderful to be here.
Perfect. I think the best place to start off, I noticed when I was in office and I was sharing with the professor before we came back, particularly on January 6th, you realize how the word democracy means so many different things to so many different people in these countries these days. I don't know if it used to be that way or not. But sadly, you know, people on both sides of the issue on January 6th believe that they were doing what they were doing in order to uphold or protect our democracy. And so I thought maybe we could start by having you tell everyone here how you sort of define democracy or what you mean by that term. And I also think it'd be interesting if you could say whether that has changed for you at all as you've studied the threats to democracy and looked at it in a global perspective, sort of what you mean when you use that term today.
Yeah, that's a great place to start, to make sure people are all sort of on common ground. You know, democracy, of course, at some basic level is just ruled by the people. But that doesn't tell you that much because, you know, which people, everybody claims to speak on behalf of the people. And so, you know, I really subscribe to a pretty simple definition, I would say, of sort of how political scientists generally think about what democracy is, and this, you know, kind of system that exists in different parts of the world that's really premised on 3 pillars. One key pillar is competition for power. There has to be a mechanism for people to compete for power, for meaningful offices. You know, monarchy is not a democracy because people just inherit the positions. People are competing for power, and they have to have free and fair competition. That's one pillar. Second important pillar is the pillar of participation. You have to have a broad segment of the electorate, all adult citizens who have a say, who can both vote in choosing who runs for office and also being able to run for office themselves. And so the broader the electorate, the more people who have the right to vote and who actually can vote, the more democratic a political system is. And then the third big pillar, I would say, is this kind of key pillar of civil liberty, civil rights, protection of civil rights, freedom of speech, freedom of association, all sorts of these kinds of basic civil liberties, the basic freedoms that all of us value so much. So each of these three things, I think, are key, and if you constrict them, then you're weakening democracy. If you expand them, then you're reinforcing democracy.
Absolutely.
So yeah. So in terms of how my ideas have changed, I mean, I would say one thing that I've grown more alert to is the nature of the importance of majority rule as well as minority protections. So democracy, of course, is about majority rule, but it's not only about majority rule. It's also about protections of political minorities, people who have the opposing view or maybe on the losing side of a particular issue. They have rights as well. And so democracy has to figure out how to balance these. And every democracy does this in different ways. And I think what I've become more aware of is in the US, we have a system, because it was designed in a pre-democratic era, that gives more protection to political minorities than any other democracy. And in some ways that's a strength, but it also, when we see certain structures of our institutions where, losers of votes can actually become office holders, this happens with the Electoral College, then we kind of have a weird system in some ways that gives a lot of protections to minorities and not as many protections to majorities. But it's a balancing act. One needs both of these things.
As you've studied it, do you feel that there's a time when American democracy was in a stronger position than it is today? Are things getting worse or changing, or how do you look at that issue of sort of how we're moving through time as a democracy?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I do really think that we're actually much more democratic today than we've been for most of our history. I mean, even through the 1960s until the 1964, 65, the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The African Americans didn't have protections to the right to vote in large segments of the United States. So we were not, in my view, a full-blown democracy until the mid-1960s. So we are more democratic today than we were in 1960. There's no question, despite all of the threats. What I think, if you believe the international indices, there's an organization, Freedom House, that ranks democracies all around the world and gives them scores 0 to 100. About 10 years ago, the U.S. had a score of 93 out of 100, which put us on par with Great Britain, Canada, Germany. Today, we have a score of 84. So in the last 10, which puts us, that's the same score that I think they give to Romania and 2 points lower than Argentina. So, and the reason they give the U.S. those scores is when you have a really difficult transition to presidential power, an attempt to block a transition of power, when you have violent threats against election workers, if you have efforts to make it more difficult to vote, which we've had in some states, then Freedom House gives you a score lower than Argentina. So I think in the last 10 years, we have experienced what political scientists call democratic backsliding. Not major democratic backsliding, but some kind of democratic backsliding that leaves us better off than we were 50 years ago. But, we face these real challenges today, though.
And since you mentioned sort of the global picture, before we get into the American-specific questions about voting rights and the different institutions that we have, there is sort of a perception that some of this democratic backsliding is happening in a lot of different, at least Western countries, all at once. Can you kind of give us a sense of what people think is going on at the global scale and why some of this is happening?
Yeah, so, we lived, I was 18 years old when the Berlin Wall fell, and I spent the year as a high school senior, or the year after high school in Germany, and so I experienced this moment. And, living through the 1990s was this period where democracy really seemed to be on the march, and the number of new democracies in the world was expanding dramatically. And then it reached a kind of high point in around 2010, if you count the organizations that count the number of democracies. The number of democracies in the world kind of reached this high point around 2010, and since about 2010, there has been this general slide. But like my other point, there are actually more democracies today than there were in 1991 in the world. And so as bad as the current moment seems, we have to kind of keep this in perspective. But there have been, since 2010, these kinds of general assaults on democracy. What's changed, I think, really, is the way that democracies get into trouble, or the way democracies die, as the title of my book is. During the Cold War, usually democracies die. 3/4 of democratic breakdowns happened at the hands of military generals, military coups. since the end of the Cold War, most democracies get into trouble at the hands of elected leaders. Politicians who are elected on a basis of democracy come into power and then assault democratic institutions once they're in power. And so places like Hungary, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, Chavez in Venezuela, these attacks come from the right, come from the left. But in all of these cases, are people who get elected to office and then once in office attack democratic institutions. And so, what I think has happened in the U.S., I mean, the way I think about what's happened in the U.S., and the reason we wrote this book back in 2018, that the first book, is my co-author and I, my co-author Steve Levitsky, works on Latin American politics. Most of my career spent studying European politics. We sort of saw, we taught courses together, we'd studied these other countries, and we thought, there's signs that something like this, could happen. There are dangers, at least in the U.S. And so I think a similar process has unfolded in the U.S. over the last 10 years, where politicians elected attack democratic institutions. What is important, though, again, I think to think about is the U.S. is unusual compared to these other countries I've listed because it's a very rich democracy, high GDP per capita, and it's a pretty old democracy. And the evidence is really clear that no democracy in the 20th century over the age of 50 has ever broken down. And the U.S. is certainly older than 50. And no democracy with a per capita income of $17,000 has ever broken down. And we're 4 times richer than that. So the U.S. should be immune from these trends. And I think what worries me and has continued to motivate me to work on this topic is that the U.S., unlike West European, our peer nations, other rich democracies, has experienced democratic backsliding like these other countries that tend to be much poorer and have much less democratic experience. And so that leaves us in a pretty unique situation.
Yeah, it's having gone through, to me, January 6th is this crystallizing moment where it's sort of the easiest point to think about, a really low moment for American democracy where I guess Freedom House docked us some points for that one. So that must be how we know that it was really bad. But on that day and say for the month afterward, even in a congressional district like mine where there were a lot of people that probably voted for Trump and it was a little more conservative, you could tell how disgusted people were by January 6th at a broad level, like not just, sort of blue jersey wearing partisan Democrats. I'll never forget this guy. He lived a couple towns over from me and he was on the local news because when that all happened, he made some kind of marble sculpture of the Capitol or something in his backyard, and he drove all the way down to where the security fences outside the Capitol had been erected after January 6th. Right, this was right before Biden's inauguration, and he just put it there, and he took some pictures of himself next to it, and it sort of got viral on our local social media, and people held it up as an example of this, just this really ordinary American who felt such a strong connection to the national Capitol and the ideals that it represented. And I think a lot of us at that time felt like it was going to be a moment of maybe a little bit of a culture shift or a swing back in favor of broad all-American support for democracy. And instead, it just sort of seemed like interest in January 6th really waned. Like as the committee got underway and whenever, Biden would sort of give a speech about democracy or something, it just felt like the interest of the public in the abstract idea of our democracy and what needs to be done to defend it was not sustained. Is that something you see in these other countries where you look at the problem that it's hard to keep people focused in almost a nonpartisan way on the system itself?
Yeah, it's interesting because I do think that defending democracy is long, grinding work. And it can get to be kind of boring to keep talking about threats to democracy, threats to democracy. People sort of get tired of hearing it. And I think in some ways the Harris presidential campaign has discovered that to some degree and talks about threats to freedom. You have to make the threat to democracy is not an abstraction. It affects people's lives, and one needs to make those connections clear. So that's really important to do that because what happens in take a country like Hungary, where Viktor Orban was a prime minister, center-right prime minister back in the late 1990s, was voted out of office and basically decided when he was in the opposition he never wanted to lose again, ran again, 2010, got elected, and has never lost again. And for 14 years, and that's been done at the stake, at the price of Hungarian democracy. I mean, you don't have military in the streets and so on, but the rules have been changed in such a way to make it really, really difficult to vote out the incumbent. And as this has happened, the opposition, each time election comes around, people mobilize, they say they're defending democracy, but it's tiring work. And if you keep losing, it's especially tiring. So that's why it's so critical, I think, to continue to be aware of, first of all, that it is hard, long grind. You have to play the long game. And it requires continued attention to it. And the second thing is just to understand that it's connected to, that democracy is not an abstraction. We're not just defending abstract principles. You know, democracies do two things that no other system in the world do. Number one, they protect our basic rights better than any other political system in the world. All the rights that we take for granted, without a democracy, they simply can't be protected. And so we have to understand that connection. That's the first thing. And also what democracies do is, in a democracy, is the only political system in the world where you can get rid of a leader if you don't like him in a peaceful way. And that's an incredible power. And you know, people kind of forget that. And if you remember these kind of really concrete ways in which being in a democracy matters, then I think it helps to make the point. I think another factor in this the January 6th case that was particularly upsetting to me as well, because I'd seen instances of this in other historical periods. You know, there's often assaults on parliament buildings. In the book, we tell the story in France in 1934, there was an attack on the French parliament building as they were trying to decide who the new prime minister would be. It was veterans groups, right-wing militia groups attacked the building with long poles and flags and very similar kind of stuff. It turned out a lot of the right-wing members of parliament knew this was going to happen, allowed it to happen, and then after the fact excused it and said the real criminals were the police who were beating up on the protesters. And so you had this kind of split reaction of French society. The Republicans, who were kind of centrist and left-leaning, said this was an attack on French democracy. The right-wingers said this was not. And you had two parallel histories, and it left France incredibly vulnerable. This is 1934. By 1940, when Germany invaded, you had large segments of the French public who embraced, you know, the French were nationalists. They hated the Germans. But there was a very famous slogan at the time. The leader of the French socialists was a guy named Leon Blum. They said, better Hitler than Blum. And so they really, this kind of fear and animosity towards the other side. And the reaction to the event, I think, played a really important role. So the lesson I draw from that is that you have to have a cross-partisan response to these kind of events, where political elites of the left and the right understand that democracy matters more than party. And if you had, I mean, kind of think of an alternative world in which you had politicians from the left and the right, Republicans and Democrats, uniformly condemning this as unacceptable, I think public opinion would look different today. I'll give you an example of where that has happened. Spain in 1981, shortly after Spain's transition to democracy, there was an attack on the Spanish parliament. These kind of low-ranking military guys attacked the parliament, came in with guns, shot bullets into the ceiling. All the members of the Spanish parliament ducked under their desks. And very quickly, the police came in, they rounded these guys up, and within days, from the post-fascist right all the way to the communist left, these guys marched in the streets, tens of thousands of protesters in the streets saying we're going to defend Spanish democracy. This will never happen again. And Spanish democracy has been pretty stable since. So I think these cross-partisan responses saying that violence is unacceptable in democracy are really critical.
That's an excellent point, and I feel professionally obligated to state for the record that actually what happened in the immediate aftermath of January 6th was exactly that, where you even had Mitch McConnell condemning what had happened that day. The difference was that one side sort of lost their will to criticize their own leader. And in fact, the institutional response in Congress was to write and then pass a bill designing a 9/11 style commission to investigate the Capitol, meaning there would have been politicians on it. So if you remember the January 6th committee as being filled with Democratic politicians plus Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, the reason for that is because after we passed the 9/11 no politician bill in the House, Republicans decided to defeat it in the Senate, and they didn't want a commission of any type. So we ended up with this sort of political commission response as a result, even though technically bipartisan, but that was because we couldn't get one party to cooperate with it, which I think naturally leads into where we should go next, which is your work on tyranny of the minority. And I don't know if that was it's a very accurate title. I don't know if it was a pun at all on the idea that originally my understanding of the founders is that they were also very concerned about tyranny of the majority. And so they designed a system where sort of popular majorities would not be able to quickly seize all the levers of power and impose their will on everyone in sort of a chaotic and ever-changing manner. And that one of the things I talk to my students about is that debate really continued a lot, and you can see it echoed in the Lincoln-Douglas debates in the run-up to the Civil War, which I think is that's the sort of conceptual problem I throw at my law students every semester, which is, here were Lincoln's arguments and here were Douglas's arguments. Which side are you on? Without telling them whose arguments they were. Most of them are on Douglas's side, because Douglas was saying, let's let local majorities decide these really important moral issues for themselves. Who are we to tell people where they should stand on the important moral issues of our time? And Lincoln was more in the path of saying, there are some things you just never do, and God tells us we shouldn't do, being very explicitly religious and sort of spiritual about it. But the issue was slavery, and so we know in history Lincoln was right and Douglas was wrong, but the way they made the arguments, it almost is very different today. So I'm just kind of curious, with that background, I take from your book that tyranny of the minority has become a bigger threat to our democracy in some ways today than tyranny of the majority is. And if you could talk about that dynamic a little bit.
Yeah, I'm going to assign those debates to my students. That's a great idea. Thank you. So tyranny of the majority is exactly right. I mean, it continues to be a concern, and I think in a place like Hungary, it is a concern. Majorities can have too many powers, where it's too easy to change the constitution. A majority can pass laws that essentially prohibit the opposition, entrench itself in power. That's a problem in many parts of the world, and it continues to be a problem anywhere. I mean, and potentially a problem in the U.S. as well. But we have a constitution, a pre-democratic constitution, the oldest constitution in the world, that was designed to combat that fear, and I think it has done so very well. But over time, in some ways, exactly right, that the problem of minority rule has become a bigger problem. And so I'll just give you a couple of examples. So, we're the only democracy in the world with an electoral college. Other countries used to have electoral colleges to elect their presidents. They gradually got rid of them. Argentina was the last, 1994. And so what this means is that we're the only presidential democracy in the world where it's possible to lose an election and become president. I mean, it's kind of an unusual thing. Then you combine that with the Senate, this is an institution that has lots of virtues to it, but with 2 representatives per state. This was designed originally as a compromise between big states and small states, and that serves that purpose. But the population difference between big states and small states has grown so dramatically, that now Wyoming with 500,000 people versus California 30 million people, very, very large discrepancy, each with 2 senators. You would then add to that the Supreme Court with, which is important to have judicial review and independent judiciary. Without term limits, what this means is that a temporary majority may select some justices, and they may exist in power for a whole generation and thwart the will of the majority of contemporary majorities. And so you add all of these institutions up, and we're the only democracy in the world, I should say, with lifetime tenure for Supreme Court justices. And our Senate's the second most unequal in terms of population, with the exceptions of Brazil and Argentina. So in each of these domains, we're an outlier, and you add them all up, and we live in a system in which we're a democracy in which it's the hardest democracy in the world for majorities to win power, and once they win power, to actually govern. And so, again, we need to have carve-outs, we need to have protections for minorities. It's certain, my favorite phrase in this is, not everything should be up for grabs in an election. Not everything should be up for grabs to majorities. We need to have carve-outs, and I think, but there's certain things where majorities should govern, and I guess I would say 2 domains in particular. Elections, the person who wins the most votes should be able to hold office, and legislation. Majorities should pass laws in legislatures. So these are 2 domains, certainly where majorities ought to rule, but there's other areas where majorities ought not rule. Basic civil rights, basic civil liberties. And so I think we need to kind of readjust the balance, is essentially the point that I make, and make ourselves in some ways more like other democracies that have worked out this balance a little bit more effectively.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about voting rights, but before we get to voting rights, is there any evidence in the studies that you've done that the dynamics that you just talk about sort of wear down people's willingness to participate, or the way that they feel about their vote, if they feel that, it doesn't even matter if I vote for this party because they're going to get in there and the court's going to strike it down, or the Senate's going to refuse to take up the issue. I would always hear this a lot after mass shootings. I think every member of Congress has probably different experiences on different issues, but particularly after mass shootings, you would get these people just enraged about the fact that if you believe public opinion polls, you may have more than 90% of people that agree on some very basic common sense measures when it comes to guns, and yet, we really cannot pass significant firearm legislation. Does that take a toll in America compared to other societies that don't have these same things, or?
Yeah, I think so, and I think we're really beginning to see evidence of it now. I mean, we're on a whole series of issues, gun control being maybe the most prominent. I would say abortion rights, where there's a kind of difference between the court and where public opinion is. Even efforts to combat poverty and inequality, if you believe opinion polls, Americans generally support this and often, or raise the minimum wage. That's another example. Where majority opinion is not being, on very reasonable, basic public policy questions, not taking away the rights of free speech from anybody, where majorities don't get their way, and so voters become disaffected. And I think that in part fuels a lot of the kind of populist rage that we see in the US. That's one thing. Another thing, though, I would say, another impact of this is on the Republican Party. I mean, this is, from my view, part of the reason the Republican Party has radicalized to the way that it has is that it's possible to win the presidency without appealing to a majority of Americans. So Trump won the election in 2016 with 46% of the vote. This could happen again, 2024. And so when you have your base pushing you in one direction, normally in a democracy, when you lose, you kind of regroup like a baseball team or a firm. You hire a new manager, you hire new players, new employees. But in the case of the Republican Party, because they haven't needed to win a majority, this sort of breaks the key link in a democracy, the self-correcting mechanism of a democracy. And so this allows for the base to radicalize the party, and the pushback of our institutions is not really working. So it has that second effect as well.
Absolutely. Okay, we're gonna move to questions in about 5 to 10 minutes whenever we finish up this next topic. So if you have questions out there, or you'd like to think of one, you might want to start putting that on the back burner now. I want to talk about the issue of voting rights specifically. I mean, we've talked about how democracy really means this idea that the broadest possible group of people are able to participate and able to have some feeling that their participation is meaningful. And so apart from the whole issue of, all these different veto points and tyranny of the minority, can you talk just a little bit about the situation of voting rights in the United States? What's at issue in some of these big pieces of legislation like the Freedom to Vote Act that have been proposed but not passed, what they might do, and sort of how urgent a priority all this should be for people that care about democracy compared to sort of all the other things we talked about tonight?
Yeah, so we have an interesting system in the U.S. where, again, partly because of our old Constitution, we don't have an affirmative right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. Most democracies have that, and we have obviously protections. You can't restrict the right to vote on the basis of gender, on the basis of race, and so on. But there's no positive statement. And if we did have that, I think it would be a lot easier to defend voting rights. But because we don't have that, the way that we protect voting rights in the U.S. is through legislation, through the Congress, and the Voting Rights Act in particular in the mid-'60s provided a whole series of protections for voting rights, a federal regulation of voting rights, so that states can't just simply change the rules in a way that disenfranchise voters. They have to get approval to do this. And this was a system that's been in place since the 1960s and has worked remarkably well. This is why we are more democratic today. So this, the laws make a difference in people's lives. This is not just some legislation that passes in Washington, D.C. So recently, though, the kind of key premise of some key elements of that law have been undermined through a Supreme Court decision. And the critics of that on the court, there was one of my favorite quotes with some Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who the argument was, well, we don't need these protections anymore because the system's working pretty well. People's voting rights seem to be protected. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, this is kind of like going out in a rainstorm with an umbrella and saying, I don't need the umbrella anymore because I'm staying dry. So it doesn't, you need the umbrella still, you need the protections. So what these bits of these two main, it was the House Resolution 1 and House Resolution 4, I think, in 2022 that came up, were in part an effort to kind of re-protect voting rights, make it easier to vote, same-day voter registration, which exists in lots of states but not everywhere. But also included in this are some measures to deal with campaign finance, to deal with money in politics. So all the things that people get pissed off about in our elections, money in politics, gerrymandering, these bills are intended to deal with this, to reduce partisan gerrymandering, to have independent commissions and so on. So I encourage all of you to go look at the HR1, HR4, John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Freedom to Vote Act. And so these passed the House. You were there at the time. So, and then they stalled in the Senate due to the filibuster. And you actually had a majority of senators, because the Democrats had a majority, willing to pass it. Joe Biden was willing to sign it. This would have made a major difference. And again, you can kind of become disaffected and think, well, laws, what kind of, just change a law, is that really going to change things? As evidenced by the Voting Rights Act, it really does change things. I mean, voter participation of African Americans in the U.S. South, before the passage of the Voting Rights Act, voter turnout was like 2%. People just couldn't vote. And now you have, incredibly high rates of voter turnout. So these laws do make a difference. And, none of this will change before the November election, but I guess if things turn around in January 2025, these are going to be the first items, I think, on the agenda.
Yeah, we sort of got this interesting natural experiment in 2022, which is that, for a while, and I first went into Congress in 2018, so I had the chance to see, if you remember the 2018 general election, there was a lot of controversy coming out of Georgia in particular, and the Stacey Abrams run for governor, and that. So the issue of voter suppression was very much kind of in the firmament after that. And the argument against some of the bills that we wanted to do as Democrats was, this is sort of overblown. Anyone that wants to vote can vote. People stand in long lines, but they're allowed to vote if they want. The people that want to vote are voting was sort of the claim. And then we didn't pass those bills, but what happened in 2020 was in a bunch of states, because of the pandemic, changed the way their elections were run. They either increased mail-in voting, increased early voting. They did a lot of things to just make it easier for people to get their ballot into where it needed to be. And you saw increases in participation in a lot of different types of places. States in the South where historically voter suppression was an issue, but also here in Pennsylvania, where we were this interesting outlier where we happened to pass a mail-in voting bill at the state level almost by accident that had nothing to do with the pandemic, and it was driven and supported mostly by Republicans here in Harrisburg. Actually, I think they believed that it would advantage their voters who tend to be older, homeowners, that sort of thing. But then the mail-in voting right that it created came in very useful to people in the pandemic when they didn't necessarily want to stand in long lines and go into closed spaces. But the point being that when you liberalize the rules about sort of when you could go and cast your ballot, all of a sudden a lot of people were participating that weren't before. And it suggested that while that you might not call that outright suppression, clearly there was an unmet demand before that the rules could affect. Is that?
Yeah, and if you think about other democracies, most democracies do everything they can to make it easy to vote. And historically in the U.S., that's not been the case. So you have election day on a Sunday or make it a holiday. You have automatic voter. You turn 18, you get sent an ID, and you can go vote. These are all efforts to make it as easy as possible to vote. And for too long, I think in the U.S., that's not been the case. And so, these are efforts to do it. And and I should say that there's, it's not. For a long time, I think Democrats thought and Republicans thought as well that higher voter turnout benefits Democrats. And for a period, that seemed to be the case. But, my sense of the evidence that's coming out is increasing. It's not automatically clear that higher voter... It's
not obviously the case. No,
and
not
so
at all.
It's not a partisan issue. And so really the defense of this is two things. One, that it's just inherently more democratic if people can vote. And that's a good in itself. But I think there's this other sort of less appreciated good, which is the people who tend not to vote are the people who are not as partisan aligned in partisan fashion. They are, there have been efforts to kind of figure out who are the people who are not voting, what would happen if they did vote. And these are often a kind of great reservoir of potentially less polarized voters, and it may actually depolarize our politics to have more people vote. So in the end, I think it helps address this issue as well.
That's really an excellent point. We didn't get to talk too much about polarization. Maybe it'll come up in the questions. But when you meet people who are not swing voters, as in swing from R to D between elections, but they're swing voters in the sense of do I vote or not vote at all, they often are people like you're describing who may have opinions sort of across the whole spectrum, not extremely partisan in one direction or another. And I do think if you believe that, at its core, democracy, the worth and dignity of every person in our society, that everyone deserves to have their voice heard, even if it's one voice out of 350 million, measures like you see in the Freedom to Vote Act and John Lewis voting rights bill are about that. They're about encouraging participation no matter which side is advantaged by it, if any. And if you think the problem was solved in 2020, just remember that a lot of the action in 2020 in terms of changes was at the state level, like here in Pennsylvania. And that means it can be taken away much more easily than could a federal statute like the Freedom to Vote Act, which, could, for example, say that states have to do a 2-week period of early voting. How exactly to do it is up to them, but you've got to make it possible for people to vote during those 2 weeks because, they might be working a long shift on election day or not have childcare or whatever the barrier is. All those things just increase chances to participate. So now we're going to move to the question and answer portion from the crowd. And I think what's going to happen is that the folks that run this bookstore are going to walk around with microphones. And so they are going to be the ones to choose who asked the question. And then Professor Ziblatt.
Beautiful bookstore, by the way.
Yeah, it's incredible. It really is. It really is awesome. Give them a hand.
Thanks for hosting us.
Yes, so if you have a question, just raise your hand. Kiana and myself will be coming around with mics. As a question is being asked and answered, feel free to put your hand back up so we can get to you before the answer wraps up.
And just a general note for the courtesy of the crowd, I'm sure you all know this, but please make sure your question is actually a question. I've done a number of these town halls and things when I was in office, and a lot of times it's a series of statements. And just try to keep it to like a minute or less. We don't need to hear a speech before your question. So politicians are the worst offenders of that. So I know of which I speak. Go ahead.
Promise this is a question. First of all, HDD is a favorite, reference it all the time. Thank you for coming here. I am both a practitioner and a theorist, academic, and working on the campaign right now, and I'm interested about sort of a tension that I see between the two. New York Times Siena polls in 2022 and 2024 showed that Pennsylvanians in particular, biggest battleground right now, only have about a 7% chance of saying democracy is the biggest thing driving their vote right now. So that's the theory part, that's the practice part. As a researcher, I look at national life satisfaction, what people actually say drives good life. And I find that if you start with life satisfaction and then please see what predicts it, you get a lot of things that look like democracy sort of backed out, which is exciting on its own. We'll have to talk about it sometime, obviously not now. But the way I see it between those two, it seems kind of like the best way to get to democracy would be not talking about democracy. And we see this now with Joe Biden was doing it, wasn't doing great. Kamala Harris now says freedom. That's her work going forward. She's doing much better. And I'm wondering if you see sort of a tension or if it's okay for us to not talk about democracy as a way to get there.
Yeah, I'm interested in your thoughts as well, but I think that's right. And I think it makes sense. To win the main thing is to win elections and to mobilize voters. And so whatever tools work to mobilize voters, that's what you should do. So, when you hear, like calling somebody weird is a good tool of mobilization, apparently, or calling your opposition weird is a good tool of mobilization. And I think that's great. That's brilliant. I'm not a professional messenger or a kind of person who's interested in this or working on this. That's not my job. My job is to try to understand the world and try to understand what's at stake. So, if I were to ask my daughter, how was school today? She said that it was not great. The teacher wasn't great. I would say, what was wrong with the teacher? If she said he was weird, I would say, come on, that's not a real description. Tell me what's really going on, right? So, as an analysis, the word weird is not great. Great messaging term. Stick with it. But I think what we need to also understand, go one step further to understand, as an analyst trying to understand what's at stake, we need to understand this because this is not, and so people, earlier today somebody was asking me, isn't it a problem that the election's just all being run on vibes or whatever? Maybe, but, that what's at stake is not about vibes, so it's, the election matters, and I think everybody's trying to win the election, and so the experts at figuring out how to win elections should figure out what are the best way to win elections. So I don't really regard it as much of a tension.
Yeah, I'll just add to that a distinction that I always made as a candidate in terms of what to talk about and how to talk about it, and that's the difference between things that are abstract and things that are concrete. And democracy, as much as we all love it, is an abstraction. It's a concept. It's difficult even for educated people to define, and they can argue over its meaning. Things that are concrete are, whether $7.25 or $15 an hour. It's whether you get the child tax credit or you don't. And often things that are concrete, you'll see it across, the reason this is important is across issue sets, no matter what your issue is on the right or the left. Things that are concrete just have much more bite in public opinion and in motivating people to vote than things that are more abstract. And so I think the more effective attacks that have had to do with democracy, I think, in the last few years had less to do with, sort of holding up the ideal and saying we might not be achieving it, and more, let's just say that hypothetically you had a congressman that played a key role in trying to take away the votes of the people of his very own state after the presidential election. And I'm saying this in a nonpartisan way, so any geographic coincidences are purely coincidental. But let's say that you had that. He tried to take away your vote is a concrete, or more, at least a more concrete statement than arguing about democracy and whether it's being upheld. So I think it's a discipline and a challenge to try to maintain that distinction, and it's tougher the more complex an issue is.
Another example of that, just very quickly, is gun control. I mean, everybody wants to be able to go to the park with their kids. I mean, this is the definition of what it means to live in a civilized place, right? You can go to the park with your kids on a Sunday and watch them play in the playground and feel that they're safe. And the idea that or bring your kids to school, and the idea that our democracy is not working in a way to allow majorities to implement reasonable gun control is a very concrete thing.
We have a question right over here to your left.
Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. You talked about how American democracy is somewhat unique in Electoral College, last one there, other things. In our current situation under Citizens United, have you looked at how much more the United States spends in elections compared to, best of my knowledge, any other 8, 10, 15 countries combined when we run a presidential election, and how that is a tyranny of a minority of money?
Yeah, yes. And then it's not just presidential elections. I mean, it's all at all levels and then one adds to this primaries as well. So these are multi-year affairs, and the problem's gotten worse over the last several years because of the Supreme Court decision on this. So no other democracy has this amount of money. I mean, part of it is that the U.S. government's very big and a lot's at stake, and so it kind of makes sense that people want to, if they can spend the money, they want to spend the money. And so I don't begrudge people on both sides of any political debate wanting to spend a lot of money, but I think everybody would be better off if they just were competing with less money at stake. Everybody would be better off, except maybe campaign consultants, I guess, would not necessarily be better off. And I think actually the presidential election, as it's turned out this year, has kind of shown us that a very short election can mobilize people. People can still get excited. People can learn about the candidate. And, I guess tonight there's a interview on CNN with the Democratic candidate for president. And so,
they're probably waiting to air it until this is over, and then after that it'll go on. I'm sure
they are. Yeah, they are actually. I think I looked at that. I didn't want to miss it. So you're not missing it. But this is how most democracies run their elections. Parliamentary elections are called. You have 6 months, 3 months, 2 months. You have, debate, policy issues are laid out, and at the end of the process, I always think of when Angela Merkel when Olaf Scholz defeated the candidate, Angela Merkel's successor in Germany for the chancellor candidate. The transition of power was they met each other this was still during COVID. They met each other on the floor of the Reichstag. They gave each other a fist bump, so they were a little nervous about shaking hands. That was the transition of power. It was like peaceful, beautiful, and and it only had taken a couple of months and not much money to get to that very easy outcome. So I think that's very possible. The problem, I think, is that there are this Supreme Court decision that has regulated this, but we get into more of the details of this Freedom to Vote Act. But these attempt to deal with this. There's attempts to kind of limit this and still nonetheless make it constitutional.
Right over here.
So thanks for coming to Harrisburg. Appreciate that. I read your book, and the best feature of the book for me was I had about 1,000 questions, and I know we don't have time. I'm going to follow up on the gentleman's statement. As I understand your definition of democracy, it would mean the people have the ability to meaningfully and effectively participate in, contribute to, learn from, and shape the decisions and conditions that impact life, individually and collectively. It doesn't exist in the economic system, and most people live most of their lives inside the economic system. I'll just give you one quick example. One of the basic rights of the owners in the economic system is the right to determine how to invest and disinvest. So they can decide, their decision to close down a factory in the United States is a private decision. Even if that decision means moving to some low-wage, high-exploitation country overseas, thus devastating the lives of working people here in the United States and destroying multiple communities. The people, the workers whose lives were devastated and the communities who were destroyed had zero right to participate in that decision. So for me, I have trouble describing the United States as a democratic society when power is centered in the corporate banking finance sector where we have no voice. So that's a statement. I would like to hear your response to the statement.
You have a statement. Say, what do you think? Right. That's. What you're describing is certainly a real problem. I mean, it in part fuels the kind of moment that we're in. I guess the way I think about it, two different ways. One, that certainly non-democracies don't deal with these problems better. Democracies, at the very least, a political system that grants the right to vote, it's an imperfect tool, competition for office, at least allows for the possibility of a kind of mobilization against things, and so that voters can push legislators to pass laws to prevent this kind of thing from happening. It's obviously imperfect, obviously doesn't happen often, doesn't happen enough, perhaps. But authoritarian systems don't have to worry about what voters think at all, what citizens think at all. And so democracy at least provides the best set of tools that we have. Now, how to make that system work better is certainly the question in a sense that you're asking. I think we do live in a democracy. And you said we don't live in a democratic society. I mean, I think Yeah, so in terms of our politics, we can vote. There's alternations in power. Very minimal, at a minimal level, we do live in a democracy. And again, the evidence is pretty clear. Democracies are better than other systems. I guess it's true that most democracies are richer. The economy seems to do better in democratic systems, and so there seems to be a compatibility at some level between capitalism and democracy. But there's also, I'm sorry, there's a fly coming around my face. Doesn't like what I'm saying at all. So, but there are these tensions because whenever you have economic inequality in a system that is premised on political equality, there's going to be tensions. And we have to, work at it. And people need to organize. This is why you have labor unions. It has to be countervailing power and work through the formal channels of the political system. It's not perfect. It's an imperfect system. But as far as I know, it's the best thing on offer.
Right over here.
Hello. So I just wanted to kind of get an understanding of how some of these countries that have experienced more extreme forms of democratic backsliding, how they recover from those experiences. I believe in Tyranny of the Minority, you cite a 2023 proposal in Israel where the legislature could overrule the review of the Supreme Court, essentially. So I'm curious how in nations such as that, where there is no formal constitution, where you have systems like that, how do those countries tend to recover and restore some form of democratic governance?
Yeah, great question. So Israel is an interesting case. I mean, you haven't had full-blown. I mean, you had mobilization in the streets in the case of Israel, pushback against the effort to reduce the autonomy of the court. I mean, this case, we were asking earlier about majority rule, minority rule. This is a case of too much majority rule, an effort to have the legislative process entirely trump an independent judiciary. And there was mass mobilization, across all segments of society. And this prevented, I would say, war has now happened. And so, that's a sort of a different story. In cases where countries have really gone off the edge and fully experienced democratic backsliding, it's really hard to get out of those situations. And sometimes countries lose wars. Sometimes a leader dies. Those aren't particularly helpful lessons. I think the more relevant thing for the U.S. is to think about how countries that have sort of started down this path have stopped going down that path. And I think there are a couple of things. One, I think broad coalitions of democratic politicians who are committed to democracy across the party spectrum need to join together and put their democracy ahead of party interests. That can sometimes play a role. A second thing that can happen is societal mobilization across all segments of society. So something very inspiring, to my mind, happened in Germany over the last year, where there was a plan to deport, the secret plan proposed by radical right party to deport German citizens of migration background. Once the plan came to light, there was this mass mobilization of not only the usual suspects of democratic activists, but German business, the heads of German industry, the largest chambers of commerce in Germany, organized together with labor unions and said this is unacceptable. And I met one banker who told me that he participated in the first protest in his life. You had millions of citizens in the streets calling out this stuff and saying it's unacceptable. I think when you have that kind of mobilization, it can be just marching in the streets, it can be releasing of statements. When you have that kind of thing, along with the role of political elites insisting upon democratic values, this has great power. And I guess we sometimes forget, and what gives me faith in democracy is, you can have a tyrant, somebody who wants to be a tyrant. But when you think if you have 300 million voters, and a majority of those voters vote another way, there's an incredible power in that, just the sheer numbers that we're talking about here, right? So I think it's possible for citizens to mobilize and to play, and the biggest bulwark against authoritarian threats are citizens who are committed to democracy, organizing through elections or through these other kinds of avenues.
All right, another question right over here.
Yes, so I have a question. I'm a parent of 2 Gen Zs who have come into the age of voting. I have a 19 and a 22-year-old who are very interested, not only themselves, but also I have seen this uptick within their friend groups of an interest in voting and politics and what is going on in the current state. And I think a lot of it has to do with the uptick of social media and kind of these places that are bringing about these questions that I see them within their friend groups bringing up questions like, how do you think of that? That myself, certainly at their ages, my friends, and we were not bringing up those sort of questions or even really, voting. We kind of just did it because our parents told us to. But they seem to be having really impactful conversations within this younger group. What do you think is like the impact social media is going to have on the on our democracy and maybe that uptick rather than the backslide? Because I see it, and not only just in my Gen Z children, but also in some coworkers who maybe previous years were like, I'm not really interested in politics. I don't like to get involved because, I want to stay status quo. Whereas I think maybe some more of the conversations, and it does stem around social media, like, oh, I saw this video and I have a question about it. How do you think that is going to impact our elections, this election or in the future for our democracy?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm glad to hear that. And I think part of it is being in Pennsylvania. I have to say, because this, I live in Massachusetts, I'm from California, and the election seems very distant. So I think, when you know that your vote really matters, then there's a real incentive to be engaged. And so that's a great privilege in some ways. I think social media, like all technologies, is double-edged, is the unfortunate news. It can be, think of, the Twitter revolutions, the Arab Spring, the overthrow of the Egyptian government was done with Twitter. So it's a tool of liberation, but it can be easily co-opted by forces who want to clamp down. Very quickly after that, authoritarian governments use social media, the restrictions of social media, to control public opinion. And so, I think my sense is that, and so I'm so glad to hear your description of this because, there is growing research and people interested in the question of why is it, or sort of discovery in recent election cycles in Western Europe in particular, where young people are surprised. We tend to think young people, in sort of a cliche, you say young people are the hope of the future, they're more liberal, they're more progressive in their values, and I think that's generally true. But one sees, increasingly young, especially young men, voting for radical right parties in the French presidential and French parliamentary elections. There's going to be regional elections in Germany this Sunday. My guess is that you'll find very similar things where there's surprisingly young voters, because of the influence of TikTok and other social media outlets, misinformed, voting in ways that are not great for democracy. But it's a double-edged sword, and I think it's about educating citizens. People need to be aware of how to deal with social media. I don't know how to really deal with social media myself, and how to deal with misinformation. So I think it's a mobilizing tool, one way or the other. whether it's for the good or for the ill, I think is still an open question. You may have some thoughts on this, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you're saying, I noticed it so much when I was a member of Congress. I would go and speak to all these different high schools, like during their school day, and I was amazed by the factual knowledge that they possessed about who the different candidates were and senators' names and all the stuff that I didn't even know in high school, and I thought I was a really politically engaged 16-year-old. And I would put it this way, that I think the plus side has been clearly in 2020 and 2022, we can see that people in the age group you're talking about voted in higher numbers than they normally do. So participation is up. My suspicion is that, like a lot of other things, it's driven by sort of the virality of social media and the temporary emotions associated with it, particularly anger about the Dobbs decision or about climate or student debt or some very specific issues, which suggests to me that maybe it won't last. And I was trying to contrast it in my mind with, like, how did I learn how to vote? I learned how to vote from being basically part of a multi-generational Irish Catholic family, everything learned from like the World War II generation and preserved, and voting was just like going to mass. It was something that you did, like something you had to do. And I can't think of a single example where anyone in my family or anyone that I knew ever really voted based on anger. Like, they always were voting based on what kind of society do we think we should have? What's the character and the values of these people on the ballot? And even though my family was Democratic, I know for sure that they all voted for at least one Republican somewhere along the way. There were people in my family that voted for Tom Ridge, for example, which is a name people in here would know. So, like, I think today, these young people that will be driven to vote, it's a good start, but I just question if it's lasting, because it's not embedded in so much of a real life community, and social media seems to actually be at odds with the creation of those kind of real life relationships that teach lasting lessons. And that's an issue that goes far beyond voting, but how as a society are we going to have relationships with each other in real life in a situation where social media invades so much of our thoughts? So that's how I see the sort of two sides of that coin, I guess.
One interesting thing is that there's a lot of good research, political science research, showing that if you vote the first time you're eligible to vote, the odds that you'll continue to be a lifelong voter are much, much higher. And so if you miss that, that's, for anybody who's just turned 18, it's more is at stake than even just election. It's a lifetime habit. And somehow there's something about that first moment, you take it seriously, you think about it, and you engage, and then you get the habit. Now, what's interesting is it may be because you're embedded in these networks that you just described. And so I don't know if that same logic applies to people who are motivated to vote through social media, but at least that's, somewhat potentially good news.
Right over here.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. It's great to be back in the classroom again. Since we're in a, we're talking academia, I want to use my words academically when I describe, I think there really are too many damn elections in this country. And does that necessarily make it stronger as a democracy to have elections from municipal every on year, off year? People are so busy, so on and so off. And how does that compare globally to how countries their frequency with elections?
Yeah, no, I think Tocqueville made that same observation. So you're in good company. When he came from France to the United States, there was a very famous British observer who came in the 1920s in the U.S. He said there's more elections in the United States than in any country in the world, and that still is the case. We have elections for offices that in most countries are appointed, these local, whatever the municipal kind of administrative positions. So it's pretty amazing. There's been efforts to reduce the number, in the early 20th century, there was an effort to reduce the number of elections, partisan elections. I don't know. I mean, there's not much we can do. I mean, it's certainly true that people become exhausted. I mean, I make the observation that in my community where I live, a well-educated, pretty nice suburb of Boston, everybody sits at home. I walk my dog through the streets, people, in the evenings, and you see people in their homes watching MSNBC, really engaged in national politics. But then I recently learned there was like 25% voter turnout in the city council elections. So there's a way in which our local politics suffers from that. And so, I think our local politics, though, is really the root of our politics. This is where people really where the rubber meets the road. So I think local elections are really critical. But we have these. It's also true that voter turnout declines in midterm election years and so on. So there may be too many elections, but I'm not quite sure what we do about that.
All right, I think we're going to do one more question.
I've got one more question right over here.
Hey there. So when I think of tyranny of the minority, the first thing I think of is what's happening in the House and Senate. Just that the opinions of maybe 5 people in the House stop really any progress from happening if it's too much in the in the public eye. Can you talk about what would help Congress to be more productive if it weren't captured the way that it is?
Yeah, no, very good question. I mean, we saw this in the kind of leadership struggles over the Republican leadership, where you had a very small faction determining, who the leader was, or, ejecting the lead, Kevin McCarthy. And you probably are better equipped to answer this question, but there's this rule in the House, that the so-called Hastert rule, where a majority of the dominant majority of it has to approve of something before something can be brought up to vote, and that in a way builds in this kind of extra bind that actually gives minorities more power. I mean, would you think about it those ways? I don't know.
In a way, yeah. I mean, having been there, the first thing I would ask you is, are you sure that you want a more productive Congress? I mean, if you think about who some of the people involved are, but I know in the abstract, yes, we do. It's the institutional design internally of Congress is a very puzzling thing. It has changed a lot over time, so that now we have this very top-down system in the House, for example, where when I was serving under Nancy Pelosi, she was the one person that was really dictating what was happening in the House of Representatives every day. And my guess is there's a lot of people in this room that support her and like that idea, but when it's someone else, you're not as comfortable with it. So it's one of those things that actually, in a way, there's a way that you could look at the Republicans in the House of Representatives and say that they have pursued a more small d democratic course in managing the House, just in the sense that they've proven that they can take down their leaders repeatedly, and they cycle leadership on the Republican side. So like committee chairs, for example, on the Republican side typically only serve for a couple of terms of Congress, whereas on our side, Maxine Waters will die as the chairwoman of the Financial Services Committee, and it doesn't matter how long she has to serve to do that. And so it's oddly, you might think of the Democratic Party as a little bit less small d democratic in the way that they run the House, maybe more efficient, maybe more capable of passing things, but that's sort of the double-edged sword there. So I think that was our last question. We're going to wrap up. First of all, I think everyone should give a warm hand to Professor Ziblatt for coming all this way. Absolutely. Where, you may attack the Electoral College, but do remember that we in Pennsylvania are a benefit of people's attention because of the Electoral College in a way. So we get him here. We probably wouldn't if it didn't exist. The other thing I just thought I'd say is, I've become more and more conscious of this as I got a chance to serve and now teach and everything is, I think most of you are here because you care about democracy, and as a result, most of you, if you really think about it, are here because you're concerned about the rights of other people. My guess is that most of you are going to be able to vote in November of 2024 without anybody really getting in your way. And my guess is that most of you, we're sort of able to adapt in a lot of ways to things that happen in this country in the last 6 to 8 years, in ways that people who won't come to an event like this may not be. So I think it's a real credit to you that you're spending your time and your attention on an issue that really is about other people and about your fellow Americans. And I definitely personally experienced how frustrating it can be to try to get involved in this democracy and make it do something. But I will remind you that it does do something from time to time. Just one example that I always thought was the easiest to talk to my staff about when I was trying to motivate them was, after Biden became president, one of the things that we passed was a child tax credit, which is back in the debate now in the campaign a lot. And it was in effect for 1 year. And during that 1 year, child poverty in the United States was cut in half from where it previously was. Half. I mean, that is millions and millions of children, like innocent children who didn't ask to be born in one neighborhood and not the other, who all of a sudden had a better chance in life because of a single piece of legislation that, despite the Senate and all the, you know, big money in politics and all these different obstacles, actually got through and was implemented. In my district alone, there were 113,000 families that benefited from that one single piece of legislation. And there's examples like that on both the right and the left. But, you know, when you talk about concreteness, like, those people exist. They will probably never come to something like this, but their life was materially changed. And given the way that issue in particular is now being debated, it might be materially changed again based on who wins this next election. So it does matter quite a lot. And all of your efforts to strengthen and preserve this democracy really do add up to things like that. So with that, we're going to stop. There's going to be a book signing. People can hang around and talk. And thank you again for coming out. It's great to see you.
Thank you. Thank you.